Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this, and what you're watching is What's Left. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next little while, I'm going to be talking about some things that I hope you'll find interesting enough to stay with us for that time. If you have any reactions to the show, you can send it to me directly. This is my personal email here, hooviating@AOL.com. If you didn't catch that, you can actually go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be around here somewhere a couple of times during the show, and you can get the email address from there, or you can leave the comment there if you'd rather do it that way. If you do send me email, to request, as always, include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's about the show, it's not spam, and to be a little patient about getting an answer. So with that, let's get on with it. This show is a bit of a special one. It's on the week preceding Thanksgiving. So it seemed that this is the right and proper time for me to engage in what has become almost a yearly tradition of mine, where I say, gather around kiddies, I'm going to tell you the real story, the based on actual historical sources story of the first Thanksgiving. By which, of course, I mean the event that occurred in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts in the fall of 1621, which is the basis of our now traditional Thanksgiving holiday. One of the reasons I do this, and have done it almost every year, is just how much misinformation, mythology, and general muddle-headedness there is out there on this topic. And in fact, it seems like what can fairly be called revisionist history has become almost as traditional as turkey and pumpkin pie. And I like to try to bring some hard historical reality to the discussion. So, to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much as must fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it not be always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. And that comes from a letter dated December 11th, 1621. It was written to a loving and old friend in England by, it's believed, Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and a leader in the early years of the colony. This picture, by the way, of Winslow was a portrait that was done in 1651, 30 years later, and its significance is the fact that it is the only known portrait of a Mayflower passenger. The rest of them we really just don't know what they look like. The letter was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantations Settled at Plymouth in New England by certain English adventurers, both merchants and others. The book is popularly known today by the rather less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation, and consists of eyewitness accounts of various events during the first year of the settlement. Now, why is this letter I quoted so important? It is the only contemporaneous account of that first Thanksgiving which is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, longtime governor of the colony, who wrote about it in his journal about 10 or 12 years later. Even there, he just sort of brushes by it. This is what he says. They now begin to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, and of which every family had its portion. All the summer there was no want, and now begin to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to that proportion. which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is built on. Everything else is speculation, interpretation, third or fourth hand accounts, and guesswork. Some of it informed, all too much of it not. Now, some things we can tell from the accounts. For one thing, from other references in those same accounts, we know that the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it was late September or early October, as that would have been shortly after harvest. In considering the event, the first thing to realize is that this was not a Thanksgiving as a person of the period would have understood the term. To someone of the period, a Thanksgiving was a religious occasion, a day to set aside for prayer to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. In fact, the first public day of Thanksgiving in the town actually came in the summer of 1623. A crop-threatening drought had led to a day of humiliation, which is a day of fasting and prayer to ask forgiveness for whatever it is they had done for God to call this down on them. Later that same day, there came a gentle soaking rain which saved the crops. And so a day of Thanksgiving was deemed appropriate. So no, this is not a Thanksgiving. Such a day would occur occasionally as the need arose. To plan for one in advance, much less to plan for one every year as we do now, would be thought a gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional, very secular English harvest feast, a celebration of a good harvest to which it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you in your fields over the course of the year, which is likely why the natives who had been helpful over the course of the year were there. Now, it's true the settlers did not have a good harvest, Bradford calls it small, but they had a harvest. That surely raised everyone's spirits. It indicated, yeah, we're going to make it. There was reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they had been through to get that far. Now, I want to make a quick aside to explain a rather subtle point a little more clearly. Europeans at the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts that were among the leadership of the colony here, they didn't make the sort of clear distinctions between what's religious and what's secular that we do today. The sense of, a feeling of, an awareness of the hand of God or the will of God in every everyday activity was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest would surely have included prayers of thanks to God, possibly a sermon by their religious leader, Elder William Brewster. These would have been significant features of the event. Just as prayer would have been a frequent feature of their everyday lives, everything from meals to musket drills to mucking about in their fields tending the crops. However, they would not have regarded this as a day of thanksgiving as they understood the term. While the prayers would have been significant features of the event, they would not have been the central features. They would not have been the purpose, not the point, not the driver behind it. Celebration was the point. Feasting was the driver. Put another way, had we been able to witness this 1621 feast, to our modern eyes, there very likely would have been more than enough praying, giving thanks, and singing of psalms and hymns to make it look like a religious or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, it would not have seemed that way. It would have seemed, for lack of a better term, secular. Anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate at this feast, we can be confident they had fowl, such as duck or goose. Remember, the governor said 4 men on fowling in preparation. And yes, quite possibly turkey, of which they took many, Bradford says. They very likely also had fish, specifically cod and bass, which are mentioned in the sources, quite possibly deer. Now, something about deer I wanted to mention because it's an illustration of how you should be careful about running too far ahead of your sources, a sin of which many of the revisionist accounts are guilty. Even though Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, which they bestowed on the governor and others and so on, we can't tell if those deers were brought soon enough to be butchered, dressed, carved, and presented as part of the feast, or if they were brought afterwards as a sort of thank you, sort of like a reciprocal gift for having been feasted for 3 days. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't actually resolve things because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which would include, but not be limited to, deer. So while they quite probably had deer, either from the natives or their own hunting or both, we actually don't know for certain. All right, getting back to the menu, lobster and other shellfish is another real possibility. Elsewhere in that letter, that Winslow letter I quoted, he mentions that they are abundant in the area, as are eels, of which they could take, he said, a hogshead in a night. And if you think eels, ew, just remember that an English person of the period would have said they're just another kind of fish. A hogshead, by the way, is a cask that holds 63 gallons of liquid. Yeah, Winslow was likely exaggerating. He was like that. Beyond that, we can reasonably argue for some other foods, such as a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit that they brought from England, some other stuff or salad in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Water would have been the major beverage, possibly the only one. Their supply of barley would be limited. Winslow says elsewhere in that letter that the English corns, like wheat, oats, rye, as well as barley, grew indifferent good, he said. There's no indication of hops. Well, no hops, no beer, not much barley, not much ale. Even if they did have some barley, they may well have not had enough time to brew ale before this feast occurred. And while they did bring beer with them on the voyage, it's extremely unlikely that there was any significant amount of that left nearly a year later. So they might have had a little ale or maybe even a little wine that they brought from England and saved for a special occasion. But again, it was most likely water, possibly even just water. All right, so that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event. Not much to build a mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pies, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came from the Great Plains, and smiling pilgrims dressed in fashions of the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail, and it's one of the reasons I go through this every year, that same sparseness of detail is probably a good part of the reason that the event provides so much latitude to those who want to replace the childhood and childish image of noble settlers and savage natives who got fed with one of noble natives and savage settlers. Every year, regular as clockwork, we get treated to the historical revisionism that, again, has become as traditional as turkey and cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we were spoon-fed as children, we find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing off with natives crashing the party at Thanksgiving and doing it in such numbers because Massasoit feared he'd be kidnapped or killed otherwise. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, is an attempt to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, pure bunk. And point of historical fact, the relations between the settlers and the natives were actually reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and disruptions, yes, but for the most part, they managed to keep intact the peace treaty mutual defense pact that they had made in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse, and I won't go into all the reasons why, but the biggest two were population pressure, which really arose out of Boston, which got established in 1630, and vast cultural differences between the natives and the English. The native culture, for example, had no concept of land ownership. Not just they didn't own the land, or everyone owned the land, or the Great Spirit owns the land. No, the idea of land as a possession, as something that could be possessed, just didn't exist. To own something for the natives meant you could pick it up and carry it away with you. How can you own something if you have to leave it behind every time you go anywhere? Which makes sense, especially for a semi-nomadic people who lived in one area part of the year and in another area for the rest of the year. But for the settlers, for any European, the idea of land ownership is an everyday concept. That cultural chasm was the source of repeated conflict. The peace finally, irrevocably, completely broke down. But that was in 1675, more than 50 years after this first Thanksgiving. The point being that here at the time, in the fall of 1621, native-settler relations were good. In fact, the very next sentences of that Winslow letter I quoted at the top were these: "We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them." Winslow also says that the other native leaders in the area have made peace with Plymouth on the same terms that Massasoit did, as the result of which he asserts there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. He goes on to say that "we for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us. They are a people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just." Now, just to be certain you realize here, trusty means trustworthy, not trusting. And quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to grasp the meaning of something. As for religion, in his later book, Good News for New England, Winslow says, "Therein I erred," and goes on to describe the native religion, at least as he understands it. Now, that description I just quoted from Winslow in that letter does not sound either like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives, or like natives who feared contact with those same settlers, or they felt they had to display massive force in order to avoid being kidnapped or killed. Now, if you're still not convinced, consider that in June of 1621, 3 or 4 months before this event, the town felt it necessary to send a letter to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the settlement in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation. This is the letter they sent to Massasoit. "But whereas his people came very often, and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome. Yet we being but strangers as yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and as we desired still to do." That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers. So afraid that they came so much that the settlers had to ask them to just not come so much. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either of these peoples is trash. Neither of them were either. Neither were devils, neither were angels. So I reject the revisionist history. Indeed, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it, first of all, because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship, and is every bit of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap we got fed as school children. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 genuinely was a scene of peaceful and friendly relations, of good feelings between English settlers and their nearest native neighbors. The first Thanksgiving, so-called, was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were still wary of each other, everyone on both sides figured that, yeah, we can work this out. Now, that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. It was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous understanding no more than a few decades, and a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty toward and genocide of the native peoples of this continent, such that while the first Thanksgiving shouldn't be a source of happily ever after, why can't we just all get along fairy tales, neither is there any need to co-opt it into the service of an ideologically driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist. And frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that one moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine telling me some years ago about the urge to find angelic forces in the world, by which he meant the seeming need of many of us to have something, to be able to fix on some group, some movement, something that we can convince ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and behavior. In our attempts to find some better balance in our understanding of what was done to the natives of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry that targeted them, too many of us, in considering the so-called pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen to simply swap one mythology for a perhaps more satisfying but equally false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. But anyway, I hope you enjoy your Turkey Day. I hope you get time to spend with family or friends, or better yet, both. And I hope you can understand why I celebrate the day as an expression less of thankfulness for the past or even the present than as an expression of hope for the future. That hope may prove to be as foolish as the one of 1621 was. Indeed, I often think it is. But the blunt truth is, hope is also the one absolute, indispensable requirement in any effort to make that future a better one. Let's take a break. And we're back. And all that talk about hope, about the necessity of hope, brings to mind the phrase, keep hope alive. It's attributed to Jesse Jackson, although I doubt he was actually the first person ever to speak that particular phrase. He is the one that made it a mantra and so can lay claim to it. And it is what we have to do, what we always have to do. We have to keep hope alive. It's one of the things I've tried to do here on this show. Amid the news and views, the anger and analysis, I've tried to maintain hope. Even in the face of the continuing advances of the reactionaries, in the face of the racism and the sexism and the classism, in the face of the willful ignorance and denial of science, in the face of the banality of evil as ongoing wars get turned into back-of-the-paper stories, in the face of all that and more, I've tried to maintain and even to offer some hope. Because the truth of the matter is that even many professional grouches like me are actually unregenerate romantics whose sharp words are honed on the inexplicable, indefensible, and yet utterly unshakable conviction that things not only should be, but can be better than they are. An embarrassingly large number of years ago, a friend asked me for some background on world hunger for a presentation that she had been talked into giving at her local church. She confessed to being very nervous about doing it and said she envied my ease at giving speeches. I answered that I envied her gregariousness, how comfortable she was one-on-one with strangers, which gave her skill in doing door-to-door petitioning. I've always found the prospect of going to a street where I know no one, knocking on strange door after strange door, with political petition in my hand and earnest expression on my face, rather intimidating. She half smiled and said something about how that didn't seem anything special or important, and the truth is, I'm not at all sure she believed me. But I meant what I said, because every one of us has his or her own strengths, something we can contribute to the struggle for peace, for justice, for the environment, for life. None of those abilities is inherently more important than any other. All are important, all are necessary, and the question isn't whether your skills are better or worse than anybody else's, but whether or not you are using them. Some, like my friend, are good at petitioning. I'm not. Some are good at fundraising. I'm not. I lack both the focused concentration necessary for large-scale organizing and the patience for phone banking. The list of my inadequacies is embarrassingly long. My strength happens to be words, writing, talking, giving speeches, and like that. So doing this simply is something I thought I could contribute. What's left has intended from the beginning to be an example of what's called advocacy journalism, a type of journalism that deals in facts, not propaganda, and wherever possible uses neutral sources, but which makes no bones about having a point of view. Journalism that, as I have put it, puts facts in an ethical context to spur action. Put another way, what's left was from the beginning intended to be a source of a voice of conscience and a tool for an ongoing movement, something of use to the many whose skills in other areas so greatly exceeds mine, something that keeps hope alive. In the show, I've been guided by 4 quotes that served as editorial principles. 1, to thine own self be true, which I'm sure you know is a quote from Shakespeare. 2, the U.S. isn't the worst, but it is the biggest, which is a quote from Joan Baez. 3, sometimes a bit of humor contains more inner truth than the most serious seriousness, which is from a chess grandmaster named Aaron Nimzovich. And 4, no one but no one, no matter their ideology, political perspective, or status as left or right, liberal or conservative, can be, by that reason, exempt from either criticism or praise. And that's from me. Okay, the reason I bring up all this now is that this is the 300th edition of What's Left, which was born under, and in fact has lived most of its life under the name Left Side of the Aisle, a name which I never actually liked because it implied that I'm a Democrat, a description which anyone who's watched the show for any length of time would know is at best inadequate. I recall, for one example, writing in 2012 how I was not going to vote for Barack Obama because he's too conservative. Anyway, yes, this is the 300th edition of What's Left. It is also the last edition of What's Left. Yes, we are hanging it up, packing it in, closing it down, whichever cliche you find most pleasable. After something over 6.5 years of an almost weekly show, it's time for me to find another way to be useful to advance the causes that I believe in. Actually, that's quite right. There will be one more show. It's a holiday special intended for the week between Christmas and New Year's on the history of why those days are December 25th and January 1st. But yes, we are turning out the lights, closing the doors, again, whatever cliche you'd like. I've said this before, it bears repeating. I have been greatly helped over these past years by several people without whose help this show simply would not have happened, and even if it did, would not have gone as long as it has. So I wanted to say thank you first to Donna, just for being Donna. She is my strength, my source, my reason to get up each day. To the staff here, I wanted to say thanks to Dylan, to Chris, and perhaps especially to Ivana, because she one time told me that she liked doing the camera for the show because she always learned something, which is about the biggest compliment anybody could pay me. Then there was Will, video editor extraordinaire of Song and Fable. And finally, there was Rich, the executive director of the station and the all-around go-to guy here, who was willing to take a chance on me. When I first approached him about doing a weekly show of political commentary, I could tell, wasn't too sure that this wasn't going to peter out after just a few weeks. But he took the chance to let me do it my way, and I hope that in the time since, he's been given enough cause to be happy with that decision. So, I guess this is time to wrap this up for one last time. This is not the end of my activism. I just need to find a different outlet for it. It doesn't even mean that What's Left won't reappear at some point in the future in some altered form. Because for now and for the future, for me and for all the rest of us, the question is not, what can I do? It's, am I doing what I can? Perhaps that only amounts to a little, to what seems so little as to be trifling, as to not matter. But matter it does, because nothing we do is for nothing. We are each of us as individuals called, required by what is right, required by the call of justice to do what we can. No one can expect more of us, but we should expect nothing less of ourselves. So instead of saying to you, as I usually do, see you next week, I'm going to say to you, carry it on. Like the man in the movie said, never give up, never surrender, and as always, peace.